thank you very much, all of you listening. I know there's at least 80 of you that have signed up, and we've got a lovely evening ahead of us. We've got Sam, Sarah and Subodh, so the three S's, who are going to, oh, sorry, and another Wendy, who isn't an S, all going to talk about what's bothering us most, which is around the mental health of the workforce, but slightly turning things on its head, and a discussion around whether we are slightly overdoing things and over-medicalising what is going on. And we all know that it's normal to feel distress in an abnormal situation, and that's what we've got going. Now, this webinar is being hosted by Doctors in Distress. So I really need to say something about Doctors in Distress. It's a charity that was set up a couple of years ago with its sole aim to reduce the rate of suicide amongst all health professionals. And we're trying to reduce the rate of suicide in two ways. One is by talking about mental illness and trying to reduce stigma, but the second is trying to fund spaces for reflective practice so every health professional can come together and talk about the emotional impact of their work and hopefully normalize some of the things that they're going through, but also gain and give support to each other. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm Claire Gerardo, who's the chair and the lead of Doctors in Distress, and other members of the team are on this webinar to help you. And if you want to put things into the chat room, please do, because they're there to help you. And I know people are coming in now. So I'm going to hand you over to Subodh, who's a fabulous psychiatrist who does weird things like cycling from John O'Groats to Land's End in the worst weather you've ever seen and survives it. So Subodh, I'm going to hand over to you, and thank you very, very much, and take care.
Thank you, Claire. As you said, I'm really glad it's not raining, and I haven't gone anywhere near my bicycle since that ride. So you can imagine what kind of effect it had on me. But hopefully come spring, I'll go there again. But I'm really so pleased to have a fantastic panel here with me today, all three lovely people. And Wendy Byrne, I think, needs no introduction to the world of psychiatry. I think she has been the president of Royal College of Psychiatrists and a much loved president, if I might say. I think you just have to see her Twitter following, and you'll know what I mean. So she's been a voice of reason, a voice of bringing in calm at a point when there has been so many things happening. And I think in the last few months of her presidency, COVID hit, and I think I hope that she'll tell us a little bit more about how she, as a psychiatrist and as a president, coordinated the response there. But then I also have with us Sarah Wollaston. Sarah, MP, GP, it's just all kind of change of initial there, I think. So you've been an ex-MP, you've been ex-GP, so bringing a wealth of experience, both from the clinical world, but also the policy-making world. And I'm sure that you will have insights into what distress is and how it occurs in the clinical setting, but also in the non-clinical setting, and how might you do differently if you don't have your clinician hat on, and yet when you are faced with distress. And finally, last but not least, Sam Anthony, I think, whom I've met only on Twitter. Sam, I'm so fascinated by your profession. So you are a dermatologist, and you've been have you been doing surgeries today? I don't know. I mean, you have. Wow.
I do surgery in dermatology, yeah.
So someone been out there actually at the coal face, and but you also set up Permitted to Pause, and I think I hope to hear from your lived experience of what it means to experience distress as a doctor and being at work. So I think I've been doing this for some time. My interest comes because I'm a medical educator, and I am involved in teaching medical students at the University of Nottingham. And unfortunately, over the last few years, we've seen more and more students disclosing mental illness when they come to our placement. And on the one hand, that has been rising. On the other hand, we've also had people say that they're finding it difficult to seek help, and that when help is forthcoming, it's not exactly what they need. So I think there's a real issue, and I think it's being talked about. Last week there was a big discussion about university students' mental health. So and the fact that when students leave home, go off to university, how stressful time that is. But we also know from research that while it's hard enough for university students generally, it's that much harder for medical students because they seem to have a higher proportion of mental illnesses, and then that maybe that's been not talked about as much. And I think I always like to say that when we send people even on a building site as visitors, we give them a hard hat, and it's kind of mandatory to do so. And yet somehow it's assumed that we will go through a career in medicine, come across themes of loss, mortality, morbidity, and somehow muddle through it. There isn't a kind of a sense of preparing us for it. I certainly wasn't prepared as a medical student, and I don't think a lot of my medical students are nowadays. But equally, I think I find that more and more people are asking me the question that a bit like communication skills courses were introduced a decade or two ago, and then people now say that we have this communication skills being stuffed down our throats. And are you going to have a whole series of support programs and this program and that program? And are you medicalizing distress? So I'm going to start with that question. And maybe Sarah, start with you first, if I may. That do you think, are we medicalizing distress?
No, I think quite the opposite. I think that there are very large numbers of people who have acute and diagnosed mental illness who just can't access services. And these are evidence-based services that we would expect people with physical illnesses to be able to access, but somehow we have a different standard when it comes to mental illness, that we kind of think, as you said, that there's this attitude that people should be able to muddle through. And I think particularly for healthcare professionals, there is that presenteeism that people feel guilty, they feel they're letting their colleagues down if they're not there, and they feel under immense pressure to be there to help their patients, and a huge sense of guilt if they don't. So very often they'll keep muddling through it until the dam bursts. And so sometimes people end up being much more seriously unwell by the time they actually do talk about the pressures that they experience themselves. And I think as well, interestingly, there's still quite a lot of stigma that attaches to doctors and other health professionals who seek help. And so again, there are great barriers for professionals coming forward and being honest. Well, not honest is the wrong word, but feeling that they are able to talk about things that they should really, and we should all be much better at enabling people to come forward much earlier. That's my thoughts on it anyway.
Thanks, Sarah. Wendy, stigma is not an unknown term in psychiatry. I think we know that our patients experience this all the time, and we see it in our clinics every day. Does it affect our colleagues as well?
Absolutely. It has improved. So I've been working with trainees. I became a consultant in 1990, and I've been working with trainees all that time, and it's improved. Trainees are more willing to admit that they're suffering from mental illness than they were, but there's still massive stigma. There's actually stigma against being ill at all. Doctors are not supposed to be ill with any kind of illness, but they're particularly not supposed to be ill with mental illness. And yes, the stigma's improving. And actually, one of the things, I spend a lot of time on Twitter, as people already mentioned in the chat. One of the things that's improving the stigma is social media, and we now have psychiatrists tweeting about their mental illness, tweeting about the fact that they've had ECT. That kind of public talking about it would never have happened in the past. So it's improving. We're getting there, but there's still a lot of stigma.
And Sam, I mean, sometimes I find that as a psychiatrist, these discussions almost feel as if only psychiatrists get mental illness. But surely that can't be true. We know that can't be true. All medics must have experienced some form of mental illness at times. So it's not something that actually I've had colleagues say to me that our psychiatrists are more vulnerable to mental illness, and I mean, I think there's that kind of a little bit of a myth around, isn't there, that people in the acute hospital are a bit more immune to these things?
I don't think anyone is immune to these things, and as for all the reasons that we've said, that medicine as a profession is difficult with what we're exposed to and from quite a young adult age. I think we do all experience issues with our mental health throughout our career, but
reaching mental illness, as it were, so becoming almost the pathological state, that it comes from somewhere. It all begins somewhere. Distress begins somewhere. Mental illness begins somewhere. And I think, are we medicalising distress? We are, for good reason. But I also think that at the beginning of being able to communicate how we feel, that needs to be perhaps taught a little bit more. We need to understand and accept that anxiety and feeling down, some of those normal emotions, feeling stressed, you know, if they're proportionate to the stressor, they're all completely normal human emotions. And I think if we can learn to talk about them in an early stage and not feel stigmatized by feeling those things, perhaps they won't accumulate, you know, with the right support, obviously, as well, and then become chronic and then become an illness. So I do believe in a lot, we all do, don't we, about the prevention of this, but preventing it in the early stages so they don't become the chronic sort of crisis moments that I think a lot of medics do reach.
I think you're quite right, Sam. I think I work as a liaison psychiatrist now, and I sometimes get referrals from oncology or you know, or palliative care, and there's almost a sense that, well, it's understandable that they have depression because they've got this terrible illness, and because it's understandable, almost that we shouldn't treat it. But I mean, just because something's understandable doesn't mean we don't treat it, right? I mean, so I think and I find that something of that sort sometimes happens in with our colleagues as well, that obviously there's so much stress, so much pressure. It's understandable that I'm feeling like this, and so I shouldn't take care of it, or so I shouldn't medicalize it. You know, I think that kind of the next step comes in. Is that something, Wendy, you nodding your head? Is that something you come across?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking back to discussions I've had with trainee psychiatrists way back, and they'd say, you know, I'm a hopeless person. I'm waking at 4 a.m. I can't eat anything. And they give you sort of, you know, textbook all the symptoms of you know, depressive episode, and I'd say, and what do you think might be causing this? What might be wrong? And they'd be terrible at actually kind of thinking, yes, they could be ill, and maybe some treatment would actually sort that out. So yeah, I think doctors are particularly bad at that. GPs are very good at spotting it. So I used to be arguing with them and telling them they were depressed, and they wouldn't believe me. And then they'd go and see the GPs, and the GPs would spot it and sort it out.
So we've talked about the variety of factors that might stop people from you know, fear of failure, kind of, you know, not wanting to the presenteeism, etc. I mean, are there any systemic factors? Because one of the things that I come across all the time, and people say this, that, you know, that if you mention the word resilience again one more time, then I'm going to pull my hair out. Nothing. There's almost this anti-resilience feeling that's come in, and I wonder whether that's justified. I mean, surely we all need to be a little bit resilient too. I mean, that's part of our training should be to you know, acquire some degree of resilience. We teach that to our, we discuss that with our patients too, don't we?
We do, but I think sometimes there's a risk there that you blame it on individuals by saying they're ill because they're not resilient, rather than actually addressing the underlying system issues. If you're working in a system that is so impossibly pressured, where you can't have breaks, sometimes you can't even, you're hearing stories of people not even having access to fluids at work, let alone getting a lunch break. And if you're doing a job that's simply become undoable, and you're always having that feeling that you're not able to perform at your best, or even that your professional qualification, your professionalism is going to be called into doubt because it's just not a doable job, then I'm afraid that's not about resilience. That's about the priority being to tackle the acute workforce pressures, and sometimes even the basic stuff like trainees not knowing what their rota is going to be, not knowing whether they'll have time off to attend their own wedding, or just actually, you hear time and again utterly depressing stories of people in teams where they're being belittled in front of other team members. So there are lots of systemic issues that I'm afraid we have to address, and not just say it's all about somebody being a bit of a snowflake or implying that they're a snowflake, when in fact actually it's an underlying system issue.
Sam, do we need some kind of permission from somewhere? I mean, I think, is there some other, are people fearful of the GMC, of their trust employers? Whose permission do we need to kind of, to acknowledge this?
Well, isn't that a good question? I mean, through Permitted to Pause, the concept of pausing for good health and mental and physical, and for, good performance, that's not a new concept, but the idea of permission has raised a lot more interest, because that question is, where does that come from? Who are we going to ask for that, that allows us to take those pauses, that allows us to address our issues, the issues that are being brought to us by the systems and the processes we have to comply with. And I think we have to seek permission from ourselves, and we're also seeking permission from another. And I think permission, I probably split it into intrinsic and extrinsic in terms of where that might come from. So I think intrinsically it might be based on, our own individual factors, our personalities. I think as a group of doctors, we've always been ambitious. We are very self-critical. We are seeking to perform, obviously, for good reason, with the best outcomes possible. There's interactive competition, which can be healthy, it can be unhealthy. There are all sorts of factors, I think, within us that, perfectionism, I feel like that's a condition I've got over, because I felt that was rather unhealthy at times. So there are lots of things, I think, that stop us. And then this very, very strong sense of duty and work ethic, that we have come into the profession with those things. We've developed those things as well, having come into it as a vocation. But I think we stop ourselves from taking breaks, from doing what we should for our own health, because we actually are we have huge responsibilities to the patients at the end of the day, and we are taking on huge responsibilities with our colleagues, and we don't, as you say, we feel guilty if we if we're not working as hard as the next person, or we're taking a break because that means the other person will work harder. And then the extrinsic factors impact equally, if not more. There are the system issues, as have already been mentioned. We are a little bit out of control, I think, as medics on the shop floor, of what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. Our time is controlled, the number of patients we have in our clinics is controlled, and it still gets overrun. There's so many factors, I think, and addressing all of those, it has to be a multifaceted approach, I think. That's
really fascinating, Sam, because I totally get this, the way you classified it, so helpful, intrinsic and extrinsic. And Wendy, let me come to you, because I mean, you've been the president of the college. You must have seen systems at play nationally, and you must have sat in meetings where they've discussed these things. I think, looking at what Sam has said, I think, and relating to myself, I feel that finding personal meaning is very important. And sometimes if you think of yourself as a cog in a wheel, that just doesn't give that personal meaning, personal satisfaction, and that disengages you. It kind of makes you less involved at work. And then I feel that kind of sometimes builds up to cause stress at work, which sometimes is not even very well defined. I've seen some of my colleagues kind of feeling stressed, but they're not able to put their finger on it. And it's, to me, it feels like that they're not finding that personal meaning. Is that something that you've come across?
Yeah, and going back to resilience, I've sat in a lot of meetings where people have talked about resilience training as being the answer to everything, and and that puts the blame on the workforce. It's just that they've not been trained properly in resilience. I don't really think you can train people in resilience. The nearest you can get to it, I think, is psychotherapy training. I did a lot of psychoanalytic training early on, and that has really helped me in a lot of my different roles. So I think that's the nearest I can think of. If I was asked to train the workforce to be resilient, I'd say, well, let's get them all into Ballant groups. Let's get them all. Let's teach them a bit of psychotherapy. But and then the other thing about resilience that always gets missed off is what happens outside work. So I've been really lucky in that, I've had a very stable home life. I've had children. I've got my lovely cats. And that all helps immensely. If you've got a family behind you, that really helps. But that's not a choice. I've been very lucky. Not everybody is as lucky, and not everybody can make that choice. So yeah, resilience, I don't think you need to be really careful how you talk about resilience, because it can lead to blame, and I don't think you can really train a workforce to be resilient.
I think that's a good point, isn't it, about blame? I think because I think that is what exactly some people feel. They feel that they feel that the onus is put on them. But I think take your point about the having those extrinsic roles and having something meaningful outside work. And I clearly enjoy my running and cycling a bit, but more so running than cycling. And I think that really helps. But I feel that it's not always easy to kind of I feel that as a system, as and maybe particularly true of the NHS, I think when you read about Google and you think that they are, they are allowed to bring in their s- activities, sports activities into work, and then there's much more of their collegiate feeling at work. Do you think we've lost that? I mean, I remember, I think when I first started, we used to have our consultants versus juniors cricket matches and five-a-side football matches and all of that. It just seemed far more collegiate. We had canteens that you could go out to and hang around with our seniors, get some advice there and then. Now it just feels that we're all so fragmented. We don't even see each other very often. Do you feel all these factors, or are these two? Because I've mentioned this a few times to some people, and they say, "Oh, it's all too fluffy." Is this all too fluffy, or is this all relevant?
Yeah,
And then we should try
I've
and go
seen
back
I've
to it.
seen that. I've seen that. So when I was a trainee, when I was first a consultant, the hospital I worked in, one thing, we were all in the hospital. I mean, we're all out in the community now, aren't we? We're all out in community bases with maybe one colleague if we're lucky. But in those days, we were all based in the hospital, and there was a staff room. Well, it was for doctors. Doctors and medical students, and there was free coffee in the morning and free coffee in the afternoon. And if you went in, there would always be people there to talk to, and people went and ate their lunch. So it was a kind of more leisurely time. Why things have got so much more pressured and so much busier? Partly, obviously, the number of ill people's gone up, but I think something else has happened. A horrible feeling, it's computers, that we spend so much time putting stuff into computers, which we never had to do. Something has changed, and yeah, it was a lot better when we had colleagues that we met every day. It was a lot easier to get support.
Sam, what do you think about this human contact? Because I think certainly, I mean, and maybe I'll switch a little bit towards this year. So this has been, we use the word unprecedented so easily, but this has been truly unprecedented. I mean, and I think on the one hand, I think we all have started valuing that human contact. I mean, just the opportunity to meet our loved ones, and I think we've all. I mean, for me personally, I think I haven't seen my parents in nearly a year because they are in India, and I haven't been able to go. And I think I know how strong that feeling is. But is that something more? Had we just not thought about it in the years to come? Because as Wendy said, this is something that's been going on for some time, isn't it? We've all become a little bit depersonalized. We've all become a little bit more computerized, if you like, or robotic, if you like. Is that something that you feel has happened, or not in the world of dermatology?
No, I absolutely agree that all those things have happened, and much more magnified obviously this year. And all of these meetings, like with us, we might have been in the same room on another day, but we are remote, and meetings aren't as, they work, don't get me wrong, but that human interaction definitely misses something. The points that come across sometimes in our meetings are, they don't come across in the same way as you would hope face to face. I think we are a little bit more fragmented in the way that we're working, the pathways we're taking or have had to take with the COVID situation, more remote, even with our patients. It's not just with our colleagues. We're having much less face-to-face human contact, holding of hands, really looking at the expression in someone, their body language. You just get this. And so, we miss that a little bit more, certainly doing remote consultations as much as remote interactions with colleagues. And it is hugely important. I work in a hospital where we're actually spread across 3 hospital sites. So long term, we've not always been able to be in the same room, and actually technology has assisted at least the ability to communicate in some form, but it's definitely been more magnified for sure.
So Sarah, this is a serious problem, isn't it? Because the Institute of Public Policy and Research did a large survey earlier in the year in the wake of the first lockdown, and they said that 20% of healthcare workers were thinking about quitting because they were finding the pressure of work so much that they were genuinely feeling that they couldn't carry on and work. So this is clearly a problem for policymakers. And is this something that being discussed, do you think? I mean, you were the chair of the Health Select Committee. Was this something in your mind?
Yes, and it's something that has been raised repeatedly with government, that we went into this crisis with an 84,000 full-time equivalent workforce shortfall in the NHS, and just looking at GPs, 2,500 whole-time equivalent workforce shortfall. And so you went into this without being resilient in our workforce across the board, and also and today we've had the follow-up report from Sir Michael Marmot, which again highlights the existing inequalities across the patients that we serve, so that in the most deprived parts of the country, they're the most underdoctored and the most underserved. And so the COVID emergency has actually exposed those glaring inequalities and made an existing situation with the workforce far worse, and I think that's put huge additional pressures on. So yes, these are all issues, I'm afraid, that are not going to go away, because there's going to be a long-term fallout from COVID as well, not just in terms of the workforce itself, that I think many people are going to suffer long-term effects of this. And of course, there's the fact that so many more healthcare professionals have been exposed themselves to COVID, and the fear of COVID, and what they're seeing, the trauma of what they're seeing in their daily work. So I think we're going to be having a fallout from this for years to come.
I think I'm glad you brought it up, Sarah. Inequalities, I think obviously we saw that both COVID and Black Lives Matter shone a real spotlight on the inequalities, as you said, that existed in the community generally, and also specifically within our workforce.
Yes.
And Wendy, you were quick to respond to this, weren't you? I think as a college president, I believe you were the first college to appoint a task force specifically to look at this issue. What made you do this? Why that urgency? Why was the need for the Royal College psychiatrist to address this as an important and urgent matter?
Because I could see it was an emergency. People from a BAME background were more likely to get COVID and were more likely to die from it. And of course, our college has quite a high percentage. Well, even if there'd only been one BAME member of the college, I would have been worried. But we have quite a high percentage of BAME members. So yeah, we set up the task force, very ably chaired by your wife. She did a brilliant job, and I was really proud of what she did, actually. And our college it's probably one of the more progressive colleges, but even so, it's not always easy to get messages about, people don't want to hear messages about racism and about difficult things, but she handled it really well, and we got a message that the whole college could accept.
And I guess this is the issue when we're talking about doctors in distress, isn't it? That for some it's the intersectionality issue, I think, isn't it? I think it's aggression, microaggressions or trauma in one sphere of life, and then added on to some others. Sam, is that something that you've related to? I think we know that women for women in the workforce, and all three of you are women, so all of you could speak with qualification, but we know that there are specific issues to women as well, isn't it? I think, and especially we've seen a higher levels of distress, stress, burnout, etc. in women.
I mean, I think we do recognise there are gender differences in perhaps the way we choose to share a little bit more. Perhaps but we are very emotional beings. I will speak perhaps for myself, but maybe for many of us, that I think I have found it in my career harder to compartmentalise, leaving some of the stuff at work and not taking the thoughts home. Obviously, with experience and time in the year, you do learn to do that better, but it does take a long time. I feel like with all of these things, it's like that Swiss cheese effect where, we refer to it a little bit before a never event happens. It's a bit like that with this. There are little things that are happening, as you say, the microaggressions, the little issues, the chronicity of not taking breaks regularly, the resentment that's building up little by little by little. Eventually all those holes line up, and you get this never event at the end, which is a crisis, and then people are quitting because they just they're fighting a system, their voice isn't going to be heard, they're too exhausted to fight their battles, and it's much easier, isn't it, to just stop and walk away from it. But actually, if things were dealt with in smaller ways earlier on, it comes back to that prevention, doesn't it? And then, but again, as a female, I've taken a long time to understand all of those things through my career, but yeah.
Yeah, I think the prevention is key. I think we all know, and I think Sarah, again, you mentioned Marmot, and I think he's been talking about this for some time, about how prevention is not an optional extra. It's absolutely the key issue that we need to be focused on prevention. So maybe with your primary care hat on, is that something that you think is interwoven in our system? I'm going to go to Wendy and Sam next to think about whether we think about prevention in our services. Do you think that our primary care services are geared up for preventative work?
I think that it's a question of time, and within very pressured consultations, it's very difficult to do all that agenda about, you know, health. You're making every contact count, and so, you know, and we hear today the evidence that in the areas of the country which are the most disadvantaged, people have shorter consultations with their GPs, even though there's a greater need. And so how, if we're going to look at this as an equality issue, how do we find time for GPs to actually have the time to bring in all those other issues and time to care? And I think as well, it's about the pressure within the primary care workforce, that the relentlessness of their day in areas which are really highly pressured. And also looking more at what can be done to take away some of the tasks that, I mean, Wendy mentioned the sort of being on the computer all the time, sort of churning out data. How can we take away the unnecessary tasks? And that's not just primary care, that's it across the board in medicine, so that people are freed up to do the things that really make a difference.
I think you make an important point. I wanted to kind of think about this and then go to Wendy next. I think because we've often talked about, I think I've certainly said that, and Doctors in Distress kind of conveys this message that happy doctors equals happy patients. But the opposite is true as well, isn't it? Happy patients make happy doctors too. And I think services, and I think that's the point you were making, the services that are stretched, that are pressured, that can't really deliver the kind of care that patients need, that then make the workforce iller and less happy and more stressed.
Mm.
So Wendy, we are psychiatrists, and I'm sure that this question must have come to you all the time as Royal College of Psychiatrists president, that, well, what is the college going to do about this? I mean, does the college have a role to play in all this prevention work, or is that really for public health and policy making?
It might surprise you, but the college hasn't had prevention in its kind of plans or strategy until very recently. And in fact, while I was president for the first time, we devoted quite a lot of a council meeting to it and decided that really prevention had to be there, because up until then, I mean, we made the same mistake that everybody makes. There's no time to do prevention. You're so busy mopping up all the problems that you don't do the prevention. And the college was the same. It had never had prevention there in its mission statement. Oh, of course, things get lost in the mist of time, but not that I've known of. So yes, it has a role, but it's very difficult to do prevention in a system like ours, isn't it, where everybody's so under pressure. But we have to do more.
Sam, what do you think? I mean, I think are there things that practical things that you think could help prevent some of these things? I mean, you talked about permission to pause. Do you think that well-timed breaks, sabbaticals, things like that could help? And is that something that we've not really got a culture of that sort of thing happening? I mean, if you look at many organizations, it's a given that after 10 years or so, you might have time to do that sort of thing. And in the NHS, we just don't have that culture, I don't think.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, the thing is, it's not a very compartmentalized job. It's 24/7. There is always going to be another job to do. So it does come down to somehow either us personally, or again, having that permission from our team or from our managers, to create those pockets of time that do allow us to do the things that bring us a thriving working environment, and that we are performing because we are drinking and we're eating and we're doing all of the basic things that we need to function. But I do think that there are really simple things that we could be doing. In terms of bigger breaks, you're right. I think in Australia, every certain number of years, medics have a sort of programmed career break. I had one completely opportunistically, and it was the best thing I ever did. And I didn't do any medicine for 9 months. And I didn't realize how restorative that would be. And also, I think the culture, you're right, it really doesn't allow for that. There probably is a bit of stigma associated with taking breaks and taking pauses. Is somebody going to see you as being lazy? Are they going to see you as, not taking the flak? Whereas actually they are also suffering, and they also need the break. And I think we have to rotor it in. We have to somehow do it. Wards aren't going to shut, clinics aren't going to end. We need to factor it in. And whose permission do we need for that? We can do that actually as a team. I also think that I like the idea of like a mentoring system or like a buddying system. That's free. We can do that again within our teams. And I think just that checking in with each other, I think we're lacking that. I can go a week without seeing some of my colleagues because our breaks and our clinics and our surgery are just, they're not, the breaks aren't meeting at the same time. But I think if we have that other person, that we're sort of responsible to ask them how they are and them to ask us, and we can debrief, and we do that once a week. We don't do that just in our once a year annual appraisal. I've been an appraiser, and it feels like, it seemed on many occasions that that's the one time in the year that this individual comes and offloads all of these things, which actually, the job plan could have been looked at months ago, or this could have been changed then, and it would have, the small things actually can make big changes to them in their lives and their working lives. So that's something I've thought about. And also I do have a thought that sometimes it's the ones who need it most are the ones who probably aren't going to be as motivated to seek the help. So I think, bringing almost not mandatory, I don't want to make anything forced, but if the culture made it such that we all had to check in at some regular point, then the ones needing it most wouldn't be lost. And I do think you can be as isolated in a team of 20 as you can as a single-handed GP. I just think, that you need to find those, make sure those people are actually getting heard and seen.
I think there's something there about teams and mentoring, Sam, because I at the start of the lockdown, we just formed a little group on WhatsApp, a few different people across the country. I just contacted them because I knew that they'd be interested in training, supporting trainees. And I don't think we ever got to thinking about supporting anyone else. I think we just ended up being a support for each other, I think, and that group has been fantastic. We've done a lot of work together, but we've also had a lot of fun together, all remotely, of course, but we managed to do that. And I think it has really been a great support in this difficult year, actually. So I wonder how do we institutionalize this, Sarah? I mean, are there ways of making this happen on
I
scale?
think there are. I mean, my experience throughout my career is that I have done job shares, and job shares are a great way of working. But of course, not everybody has the luxury of being able to do that. But it is having that sort of close relationship with somebody and working less than full time. If that actually can be very helpful for people who are under pressure. But the other thing is, I think we should look more at trying to not lose people at the end of their careers, but trying to encourage people towards the end of their careers who would otherwise leave altogether to be able to stay on, even if part-time, because then they have got more time to do that mentoring and support. And so I'd love to think that there was more that the NHS did to encourage people to stay on, even if only very part-time at the end of their career, just specifically because they can be so helpful in that sort of mentoring and supporting role. And we just lose too many people altogether from the profession because they walk away completely with burnout.
That's a good point, Sarah. And I think maybe I wanted to throw it open, and any of you that you feel you can answer that I have seen a big change, even in the last couple of years. I think maybe it's going on for more in primary care, but certainly in psychiatry, I've seen that the number of locums has increased dramatically, and a good number of them are people like you said, Sarah, people who have retired and come back. But in the GP world, I was doing a talk not long ago, I think just before the lockdown, and it was a room full of about 300 people, and all of them were portfolio GPs in East Midlands, doing 2 days on a triage clinic, one day in ED, one day on the phone, walk-in clinic, etc., etc. And that astounded me. I had not really cottoned on to the idea that, well, my God, so many people are now working purely in this portfolio fashion. Is that the future? Is that the way to try and keep balance? And are people sometimes stigmatized for being locums or being not having substantive jobs?
Well, I think there can be disadvantages to being a locum, because then you're not attached to a team and you can miss out on a lot of that support, and patients can sometimes miss out on having that continuity of care. But what I mean more is that actually having people within teams, attached to a team, where they're working less than full time towards the end of their career, rather than risking losing them altogether. But we should be looking at why people are being driven towards doing locums rather than being part of a team, because actually what people are looking for is the opportunity to work more flexibly and part-time, and the NHS needs to get better at making that possible for people within teams, rather than actually only that being possible if they're doing locums. So yes, of course locums will always be there. There'll be some people for all sorts of reasons where that really suits them to be working in a locum capacity, but there are downsides, I think, as well for everybody as well.
But he's a flexible working, isn't it? That is key, isn't it? I think if you provided people with that opportunity to work flexibly, and that might help. Wendy, certainly in psychiatry, that's a big issue, isn't it? Flexible working might help there.
Yes, absolutely. And the psychiatry, it was kind of ahead of the other specialties. So it started flexible working quite a long time before everyone else, but now we've dropped behind a bit, I think. Because there are some specialties now where if you want to work flexibly, you just say you want to be flexible, aren't there? And psychiatry hasn't been one of them. Not that we didn't volunteer, we did volunteer, but we weren't actually chosen. So I hope we'll follow, I hope that everyone will follow that pattern, and you'll be able to just make that choice if you want to.
Sam, anything you want to add to the idea of flexible working?
I think flexible working is the key, is the way forward. I think certainly traditions have changed perhaps in this profession, that once you had, for example, a GP partnership, you were married to it, that was it forever, and you really, I don't think it was looked upon favourably if you suddenly changed or did more than one thing. But over the years, I think that has become much easier, much more accepted. I definitely champion flexible working, and also just doing things that aren't the same. Like, even if you're a locum 3 days a week in medicine, you could do a couple of days a week doing something else. It could be medically related or not medically related. I think we're so enveloped in the eat, sleep, work, repeat kind of cycle sometimes, that to have a bit of flexibility in your working life allows you to do other things, like the physical health things. You can cycle and run and do all of those things, which is really important for physical and mental health as much as anything, to support the work you're doing as well. And I always say a patient would much rather a happier, healthier doctor looking after them. And I think flexible working just enables that a lot more.
So in the last section, I want to try and end on a positive note. So I think we know that government has announced some funding. Matt Hancock has said there's some money available to support the health and well-being of the workforce. How should that be spent? Wendy, start with you. I'm sure I'll give Sarah the last word on that. But
I think employing an ex-president would be a good way forward. How should it be spent? Well, Claire's service is amazing. So Claire Gerard, I mean, her service has expanded now, hasn't it? But that's amazing. I've kind of followed that as it's built up, and I've had friends who've used it, and that has been really good. So I'd like to see that expanding more. There are so many different ways. I don't know how much the money's going to be, and there are so many different ways that you could spend it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think I've certainly referred many of my colleagues to NHS practitioners, and they found it really helpful. So I think that certainly is helpful. And I think we're definitely seeing that groups that might not have otherwise sought help are now coming forward and seeking help, which is good. So those are all encouraging statistics. But we started from a low base. I think we need to remember that. So it's a long way to go. Sam, I think it's 500 million pounds, if I'm not mistaken. I may be wrong, but I think that's the figure in my head right now. How would you like to blow it?
Well, clearly the services that are out there are absolutely fantastic, and Doctors in Distress is going to provide more of them. I think I worry a little bit sometimes that, again, it requires the motivation of that person sometimes, or a referral from another, obviously, to get that service. If those services could be brought to the workplace, I think that would be an amazing thing. But I realise that would require a lot of manpower, and it would require funding, obviously. Often, well, we do have some spaces at work that are sort of well-being spaces. I think some kind of facility for people would be great. But again, it comes back down to, would I be allowed to have the time to go to that place and use those facilities? In my hospital trust, we had the most amazing setup at our local football club during the greatest point of the crisis for a couple of months, and it was fantastic. It just set up some really simple things in quite luxury surroundings, and I've never seen well-being facilities used in that way ever. It was fantastic, and people really gained a lot from it. There were rest spaces, there were counselling rooms, there was free tea and coffee. Those sorts of things are wonderful. You've got to know where they are, and you've got to be able to go and use them. For some reason, we were able to for a period of time, and then suddenly it all got crazy again, and also the facility ended. So perhaps some funding on that, and just spaces that people can go to, which is a little.
That's a really good suggestion. I mean, at a very small level, we've been doing this in my trust, and in a way, it shows that it requires a bit of a mind shift to be able to agree to something like this, because we set up what we call run, walk, talk. And being a runner, I was interested in something like that. So, and I wanted to get my medical students and trainees involved in doing something with patients, but we also wanted to bring in the importance of physical activity and nature. And so we said we'll organize a marshal run, walk, and a walk in the local parks. And the local running groups came on board, and the local community, the park council and the council, and the local Live Well project, and a whole lot of other community agencies came on board. And CPNs were coming there with their patients, and doctors were there. And our chief exec was absolutely okay to say that, well, you can do this on a Thursday morning, a couple of hours in the park is fine, because you're out there with your patients, and that's good. It was good, fantastic learning for trainees and students, and it was a genuine interaction with the community. It required a bit of a mind shift to do something like that. It didn't require a huge amount of money, but there are always people who say, well, this is X £100 per hour of consultant time that is being spent in the park, and I think it just requires a different kind of mindset to make something like that happen. And then you see the magic unfold when you do that. Sarah, to you must have given this some thought, I'm sure, as to how could the money be spent?
How would you spend the money? Well, first of all, I say that the 500 million is something that's across all for patients as well. That's not just being spent on workforce wellbeing. I gather that it's nearer to about 10 million, which is for workforce, which is a very small amount, really spread across the whole of England. So how do you spend it best? Well, I think you can definitely fund organisations like Doctors in Distress, because we know that if you build it, they will come, as they say, and if the service is there, people do want to use it. So make sure that those kind of specialist services are properly funded. But then I would say, as everyone else has said, ask the local workforce what they want. Don't just impose it as a one-size-fits-all across the system, but ask local wellbeing groups what they would like to see it spent on, and what the answer may be different in different trusts.
I think that's really, really the key, isn't it? I think to get people involved in discussions around this. And I feel that I want to address this because the thing you talked about this, Sam, is that ultimately, as a psychiatrist, I know that though I'm a psychiatrist and we should be able to talk openly about this, we don't. I think I saw that in my case earlier in the year. I was on crutches for a few days, and when I walked around in the hospital corridors with crutches, I was stopped 40, 50 times for people asking me how you are. And I think well, Wendy knows I lost my mentor, a close friend of ours, Professor Bowman, last year. And I sent a note to my team saying that it's been a difficult week for me. And only a handful of people actually wrote back. I think these are difficult conversations to have, isn't it? Nothing. So how do we reach out? How do we make ourselves, can we train ourselves to do that? Or what should we do to kind of, because I know funding is one thing, but involving people, having those conversations, how do we make that happen?
That's about changing the whole culture, isn't it? And the culture has changed, not fast enough and not far enough, but it has changed. And the things that will change it are people speaking out. So at the moment, if somebody goes off sick, if you don't hear what's wrong with them, you assume it's their mental health. So if somebody goes off with cancer, you pretty soon know what it is, don't you? But if somebody kind of vanishes for a bit and nobody tells you what's wrong with them, you know it's mental health, because people are much less willing to share that. So I think we all have to be more honest and open about what's happening. And then, people, leaders need to lead and model that.
I think just asking someone, are you okay, is quite important, isn't it? I think
Yeah.
we probably don't do that often enough, I feel.
And being prepared to deal with the answer.
Yes.
Because it's not, it's not very British to say that you're not okay. If somebody asks if you're all right, you have to say yes. It's Britain. Yeah. But no, we've got to move beyond that and tell people when we're not.
That's right. I'm aware of the time. I think we've got about 10 minutes. Are there any questions, Marie? If there are, please send them through. But I'm going to try and move on to ask each of you about it's Christmas time, and it's going to be probably the strangest Christmas ever. I think I don't know whether we're going to be able to spend time with more lockdowns maybe coming. We don't know what's going to happen in the next week or two. um, what advice would you give to people who are at work at this time? What should we be doing to try and make this? I mean, I know some places are thinking of not having any celebrations at all, even at work. Any thoughts? Start with Sarah. What do you suggest? I mean,
Well, yes, I mean,
parliamentary?
obviously Christmas parties aren't going to be happening this year
Oh,
within the workforce, but I know a local practice to ours, they were tweeting that they'd sent everybody a hamper, well, every member of their team a well-being hamper. And I thought, well, that's nice. It's sort of marking out, making people feel valued and special in whatever way you can. I think it's really important, and looking out for each other, and trying to sort of inject some fun in it, whatever you're doing. And so, but looking out for each other, I think, is really important.
Sam?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we definitely need to just ask how each of us is doing. I mean, plying people with a cup of tea, if you just have that 5 minutes where you manage to get out of your room. I'd love to ply them with mulled wine right now, but clearly we can't do that. But I've put up an advent calendar at work, actually, and that's gone down quite well. It's just something for people to do each day, and they've got sort of meaningful words behind them, and just makes you think about your day a little bit more. And it's got people talking, and yeah, I think we just have to pop our head. It really takes no time at all to pop your head around someone's door and say, how's it going?
I never thought I would long for piped Christmas music, but but I'm craving it now. I think I'm missing all of that. That would be nice to kind of have something Christmassy around us, because I mean, we're not even doing stuff that we would have normally done. I've really avoided going to stores and malls and stuff like that. So I'm staying put, really. So, and when you go into a supermarket, you just go in and then nip out quickly, isn't it? You don't really kind of linger or hang around. So, and all of that kind of adds up, doesn't it? It gives that something strange feeling, there's something not quite okay feeling. Wendy, you're going to spend time with the cats?
There's a load of questions, and apparently somebody has their hand up. Who's got their hand up?
Okay, well, let me have a quick look.
Yeah.
Marie?
Marie says she'll read out a question if we want.
Yeah, Marie, can you read out the question, please?
Absolutely, yeah. We've got 14 questions if you'd
Oh,
like me
wow,
to just,
okay.
yeah.
6 minutes. We're gonna have to-
So one of the questions is, how do you think you can best access doctors who are most in need of support but don't come forward to ask for it directly?
So I could start on one. It's easier when there are doctors in training, because doctors in training are pretty well monitored and people keep an eye on them. And it's the people who you usually pick up if people are struggling. Then you've got to have the right systems in place, and it mustn't be blaming them and telling them off. You've got to have systems that will support them. So it's a bit easier for doctors in training. For doctors not in training, again, the systems, you know, in a good organisation, the systems will be there. It's important that we look out for our colleagues, and it's really important if somebody sends you a really rude and nasty email, rather than getting in a big quarrel with them, it probably means that they're stressed. I mean, I have to take a breath and wait a bit, but it probably means that they're stressed and actually need a bit of support. So looking out for each other.
Great, thanks, Wendy. And
I'm
a question
so sorry.
from
I
Arun.
missed out on the questions, but yeah, Mary, please go ahead.
Yeah,
Is
question.
it okay for if you go beyond few minutes more, I think.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. A question from Arun. Is there a danger in not medicalising distress? If we normalise distress, that leads to impairment. Will it not decrease the chances of seeking help, especially in reluctant doctors? Is anyone happy to?
It's a very good question.
I'll pick that one up again, then hand over to Sam to add something. I would just say that it's a bit easier for your psychiatrist, because what psychiatrists do is work out whether people are distressed or whether they're ill. So we kind of have those skills, so it's not so hard for us. But Sam, I don't know how you do that if you're not a psychiatrist. Maybe all doctors can do it.
Not a psychiatrist, but I've been a GP, and
yeah, GPs are even better at it. Yeah.
I don't know. They're not bad at it, definitely, and also I think the different rungs that you see of sort of mental illness. Obviously, in psychiatry, you're recognising and seeing or getting the referrals for the sort of perhaps more advanced cases. I think in general practice, and even at the shop floor with your colleagues, you're probably seeing it in a milder version. And everything else through that whole scale, but you're perhaps in psychiatry not seeing the milder ones. I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Owen has a point that if we don't recognize it as I hate the word pathological, but I'm using it, that it's tipped over from being kind of normal to being an illness. There is a danger, and I think it is hard to recognize that if you're not suitably trained to. And as colleagues, we're not there to be suitably trained, certainly not in my specialty. We're not there to be suitably trained to pick those things up. But that is where human interaction is so important. I pick up the phone to someone if there's been a difficult email, but also if I haven't heard anything for a long time. I think reaching out to those people is important, and understanding why they've gone quiet. Have they been off work? Have they been on holiday? Where have they been? And then you can't make somebody share that with you. You can't make them bring out all the reasons that they feel a certain way. But if you probe a little bit, you're just opening the door for them to talk to someone about it. I don't think that's really answered Owen's question, but I think they have a point. If we don't pick it up and express that this is someone in distress, we are going to miss it.
Thanks, Sam.
I think I've got one more question here. I think that despite all the talking and anti-stigma campaigns, it is still difficult for professionals to balance the fear of losing their identity that they may have built up through their work identities. And so any tips on that? How do we try and retain that when we seek help?
I think one of the things that helps is if people who are role models talk about their own experience of distress and mental illness, and actually show that you do recover. And I've always been, very open with people about having had times in my life when I've needed help with my mental health, and actually I think it made me a better doctor, and it made me much more able to see it in others and to actually talk about it in a positive way, that there is recovery, and that it doesn't mean that it blights your career. What blights your career is not being able to talk about it and not being able to seek help. So I think that's really important, that people who've been through it are very open to talking about it, and talking about it in a way that focuses on recovery and in a positive way.
I think having that culture is important.
If I can add to that, actually, what Sarah is saying is well, adding to your comments, that the stigma can be reduced, if not removed, if the people who have been through it are talking about it. And of course, that I know that's a big message behind Dogs in Distress as well. But
there's a question about curriculum, and I think which is quite interesting. That is this something that we need to be introducing in the school curriculum, in the medical school curricula, in postgraduate curricula?
I think that increasingly people do, don't they? I mean, that's I think, you know, before I went into politics, when I was an educationalist and teaching junior doctors and medical students, that was very much part of the GP program, GP training program, was making sure that there were groups where people could talk about the stresses that they face as they first go into community settings. So I think that we're getting better at it, is my impression.
Wendy, you've been the Dean of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. This must have been part. Do you think that is adequately covered in curricula generally? Not just in our college, but also undergraduate and you know, more widely, perhaps even in schools?
I don't think it has been. I think things are changing because we're about to have a new curriculum, aren't we? And as curricula develop, this kind of thing comes in. I mean, putting it in the curriculum is one thing. Actually teaching it is the next thing, and then people actually learning it is the thing after. Sometimes people think put something in a curriculum and it's magically sorted. If you do get elected as Dean Subodh, you'll find you'll get emails at 4 a.m. from somebody saying, if only this was in the curriculum, everything would be fine. 2 pages long telling you what must go into the curriculum tomorrow, but that's only part of the process.
No, absolutely right. I think it's really about that. How do we animate the curriculum, and then how do we make sure it's learned, and how do we know that it's been learned? And that's where assessment comes in as well.
Yeah.
And I can't see any Q&A. So are there any other questions?
Simi has a question.
Simi, you had a question? Can someone read out Simi's question, please?
Simi's. Can we just, I'll go to Amandips first. How can medics spot and help fellow colleagues at all levels in distress? And I'll look for Simi's as you answering that.
Could you repeat that question, I think?
Sorry.
Marie, can you repeat that?
Yeah, I can, sorry. How can medics spot and help fellow colleagues at all levels in distress?
We've covered some of that already, haven't we? But sometimes it's obvious that people are in distress. Sometimes they're struggling. So with trainees, it might be that they're not getting through the exams, that their assessments aren't so good. Non-trainees, again, then people may be struggling, maybe sending angry emails. There are lots of signals that people send out.
I think that's a good point. I guess I can just quickly come in. I think it's also, I think, like Wendy, you said, I think it's having that organizational permission. I think some you might use that word, isn't it? I think that makes it possible. And I think having a clear pathway as well as to how that is then addressed. And I think at times I feel that people don't actually know how to seek help and where to seek help. And so that then becomes a barrier to even identifying the issue, because if you don't feel there's a solution, then you don't want to identify the problem. And I've seen that a lot of the times, is that people then tend not to address the problem, fearing that there's, well, I'll open a can of worms and where do I go next? And even things like professional support units and you know, I think all deaneries have them, and most trusts now have some form of a support available locally through their own trust, but then they're obviously national level things like Doctors in Distress, and NHS Practitioners Program, and then BMA has Doc Health Program. So there are all those programs available, but not everyone knows about them. That's certainly been my experience as I've gone around talking to people about it. For me, I always say one of your take-home points should be that make sure you have programmed in your own phone the key local support numbers that you can signpost people to, or yourself to. You never know when you might need it, so.
Simi hasn't posted a question in the Q&A, just said that they'd like to ask a question, but hasn't at the moment, so.
Okay, all right. Are there any other questions? Because I can't read all the questions. I'm sorry, the Q&A box is not on my screen.
Sure. So this is from Tony. If you don't have time to get to know your colleagues, how can you spot changes and their journey into distress and ill health, as they rarely recognise it in themselves?
And that comes to my point that the people who need it most probably aren't going to be motivated to seek that help. They probably have lost some insight. It's been such a chronically developing situation for them that they've kind of got used to living with anxiety or feeling low or feeling stressed or feeling overwhelmed. And I like to think that maybe that mentoring, regular mentoring or buddying up would really help. It's such a simple thing to do. And I think some of the other sort of counselling or therapy professions, they have that ingrained in their profession, that they do offload to somebody else. And that happens regularly. And I think that having that, even just with one other person, it doesn't have to be in a group, but somebody that you know and you work with and they understand how you work, which I think would be really helpful. Picking up those little things early and just making that person understand that they can have a voice and they can be heard and it's okay to share it.
That's great. And I've got a question from an anonymous attendee. We are noticing with fast changing services and limited resources, there is a significant pressure on the consultants to take up jobs that are beyond skills and contracts, senior management roles without proper management experience, and consultants pulled in the service management rather than focusing on clinical tasks. I frequently notice senior management reading work emails well outside or sending work emails well outside working hours, putting pressure on everyone. How can one use established frameworks such as a job planning to manage expectations and pressures rather than it becoming a tick box exercise and a ripe place for bullying?
Well, you need a whole webinar at least
on
how to make that work. You can't answer that in one question. Job planning it can be a really fantastic tool if it works properly, but too often it isn't. And too often, as you say, it's just a tick box. And then the pressures are there, aren't they? And unfortunately, I mean, I mentioned earlier about computers, emails is one of those things. We didn't used to be able to send each other messages in the evening, but you can now. And people do. When I started, we had memos. I don't know if anybody else remembers memos, but if you wanted to tell all your colleagues something, a little memo would be typed. Your secretary would type it on a piece of paper and it would go off in the 35, 40 envelopes, and that was the only way you had of doing mass communication. So that's not really an answer to your question. I'm just saying it's too big to explore.
Yeah, understood. Thank you, Wendy.
Cindy's got a question she can't read out. I think I'll
yeah, thank you.
What the question is, and I think that comes up time and again when I've done these talks as well, and that is that what about the GMC? I think, and then I know that some people have felt petrified that if they don't disclose, and in fact, some trainers have said to medical students that if you don't disclose that you have depression, then that's a probity issue. And so, the thing that you talked about help seeking, when people are kind of a bit ambivalent about seeking help, that sometimes people have tended to use a GMC as a way of pushing them to seek help. I certainly have seen that. But there's also something specifically around international medical graduates that their visa status means that they have to work at least 30 hours a week, and which then sometimes prevents them from disclosing stuff that they feel might lead to them not being able to work that many hours. And that acts as a perverse incentive in not seeking help. So it's a broad question, but I guess the broad question is that is the GMC helpful, or is it a hindrance? I think we know Louis Appleby's work, which showed that people are at significant risk when they are for fitness to practice procedures. How do we manage that? How do we kind of work with that?
I don't know if people know Adrian James, who took over from me as president, and Sarah's husband has actually been doing a lot of work with the GMC because he was quite worried about all this, and Claire has been worried about it, and he's working with the GMC on exactly these kind of issues. Hopefully he knows about the visa thing. It would be worth dropping him a line just to be sure. Or Sarah, you could mention it to him over dinner maybe. Hopefully he knows, but I know he's done lots of work with the GMC, and things have improved. I've seen a change in the GMC. So I think, try not, I know it's easy for me to say, but try not to be frightened of them. If you need help, you must get help. If you don't get help, things will get worse. If you're not well, you can't work properly, and then you will be in trouble with the GMC. So you have to get help, and that help should start with your GP.
That's right. And I find that, again, NHS practitioners is very helpful. Again, I think they understand these issues, and they can advise quite specifically around what to say, how to say it. But again, I think I also agree with you, Wendy, that I've mentored a few people who are involved with the GMC. And I think that in the last year or two, things have changed quite a bit. I think GMC goes out of its way to support people, even, and the fitness to practice issues, the escalation is very, there are stepwise escalations. It's not a categorical escalation straight up to a full panel or something like that. And I think local medical directors have also become more sensitive to this idea that you don't have to straight away refer to the GMC. They work with the GMC to try and support people without formal involvement. And then, so I think all of these things are happening. But I guess people's memories are scarred by some of these not so nice stories, and I think maybe we need to communicate the more positive stories a bit more directly. And I think maybe Anne and Marie, this might be a more specific webinar to have with the GMC. Perhaps the Doctors in Distress could do one with GMC.
Duly noted. Yeah, thank you.
Sometime and again. I'm really sorry. I think we've gone at least 11 minutes over time, but it's been such a fascinating discussion. So I think, and I can see that there are more statements and messages and questions coming, but we'll probably end it here. So it's my job to thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sam and Wendy. You've been such a great panel. I've learned a fair few new things, but most importantly, I think I feel a bit optimistic, actually, I have to say, that going into 2021, hopefully we will see a more positive way of dealing with these problems. Resources will come, and probably we'll always feel that we are short of those resources, but hopefully there is a more positive vibe around our workplaces in 2021. So any last words from each of you? Wendy?
Have a lovely Christmas and get the vaccine as soon as you can.
Thank you. Sam?
Just thanks very much for attending, and I hope it's helped someone, if not a few people, and that we keep these discussions going, because it doesn't all end just with one webinar. There's a lot more to say and do, and it will be good. I think.
So true. Sarah?
Yes, and thank you so much to everyone at Doctors in Distress for what you're doing. It's really great, and happy Christmas.
Well, happy Christmas, everyone out there attending. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you to the team for organizing this. So Marie and Anne and Claire and everyone, thank you very much. And good night, everyone, and happy Christmas. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.